Story 1. I grew up in a small, isolated village tucked away at the edge of the woods, a place where the whispers of the trees seemed louder than the voices of its people. It was a place of traditions, stories, and shadows, where the line between the living and the dead often blurred. Every family had a tale to tell, a brush with something they couldn't quite explain. My family was no different. I'd heard the stories my entire life, passed down over dinner tables and whispered by the fire. There was a road through the woods not far from the village, infamous for its haunting. They called it the Slapping Road. It was an ordinary dirt path by day, but by night it transformed into something sinister. The old-timers would tell of men biking through the woods after dark, only to return home bruised, scratched, and pale as ghosts. Every one of them swore the same thing. An unseen hand had struck them hard across the face, sending them crashing to the ground. My grandfather was one of them. He told us in his trembling voice about how he'd been riding home from the bar one foggy night in the late 70s, feeling the chill of the forest creep under his skin. Halfway through the path, it hit him, a force so strong and sudden it knocked him clean off his bicycle. When he scrambled back up, there was no one, no sound. Nothing but the eerie rustle of leaves overhead. The strange thing was, the slaps stopped after a while. For years, nothing happened, and people began to forget. The road fell silent, until one night in the early 80s, when the ghost of the hand returned. I never thought I'd find myself on that road. I'd heard too many tales, seen too many wide-eyed, trembling men recount their brushes with the unknown. But life has a way of dragging you toward the very things you try to avoid. That night I had no choice. It was late, too late. I'd stayed longer than I intended at my friend's house in the next village, and the only way home was through the woods. I tried convincing myself it was just a story, a drunken excuse for clumsy men. But the weight of the tales pressed down on me as I pedaled into the shadowy trees. The woods were alive with whispers that night. The cool air carried the faint, sharp smell of damp earth, and every creak of the trees made my skin crawl. My bike's headlight was weak, casting jittery shadows that danced just out of reach. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my tires and the rhythmic thump of my heartbeat. Halfway through the path, the air changed. It was subtle at first, an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The whispers of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by a suffocating quiet that pressed against my ears. I tightened my grip on the handlebars, forcing myself to pedal faster. Then I felt it, a shift in the air, a presence, something cold and invisible brushing against my cheek. My breath caught, and I instinctively glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Only darkness. I told myself it was the wind, but my legs felt weak as I pressed on. And then it struck. A sharp, stinging blow to my face, like a hand made of iron. My vision blurred as I lurched sideways, the bike wobbling violently beneath me. Before I could even scream, I hit the ground hard, gravel tearing into my palms and knees. I lay there stunned, the taste of copper filling my mouth. My cheek burned with the force of the slap, and my ears rang in the oppressive silence. Slowly I lifted my head, scanning the shadows for movement. For a figure, for anything. The headlight of my bike had twisted upward, casting an eerie glow on the gnarled branches above. There was no one. The woods around me were empty, silent, and still. My chest tightened as I struggled to make sense of it. I scrambled to my feet, dragging my bike upright, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the handlebars. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice cracking in the silence. It felt stupid as soon as I said it. No one would answer. But deep down, I hoped for something. A person, an explanation. Anything but this suffocating, unrelenting emptiness. I waited, straining my ears for the faintest sound. The forest held its breath. Then from somewhere above me, I heard it. A low, creaking groan. My head snapped up, and that's when I saw it. The branch. It hung low over the path, its jagged tip swaying ever so slightly in the faint breeze. I stared at it, my mind racing. Could it have been the branch? Could I have hit it and fallen? But the slap, it had felt so deliberate, so forceful. My cheek still throbbed with the memory of it. The branch creaked again, its shadow stretching long and sinister under the faint beam of my bike light. I swallowed hard, stepping back, my pulse roaring in my ears. It was just a branch, just a stupid, low-hanging branch. Or was it? My grandfather's face flashed in my mind, his trembling hand tracing the scar on his chin as he spoke of the slap. The way his voice had dropped to a whisper, his eyes darting nervously to the window, as though the hand might reach through and take him again. I didn't wait to find out. I hauled my bike upright and pedaled as fast as I could, ignoring the sting of gravel in my palms and the ache in my knees. The air seemed heavier as I pushed forward, the trees closing in around me. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle a threat. My breath came in ragged gasps as I finally burst out of the woods and into the open fields beyond. When I reached home, I didn't tell anyone. I locked the door, washed the blood from my hands, and sat in silence, my face burning with shame and terror. It had to be the branch. It had to be. But the memory of that force, the sting of it, lingered in my mind, unshakable and undeniable. Even now, I'm not sure what happened that night. Was it just a branch, or was it something more? Something that had watched and waited for years, hidden among the trees, ready to strike again? I don't ride through the woods anymore. I avoid the slapping road at all costs. Story 2. The Black Horse. They always said you shouldn't sit under the trees in the back corner of our school field. That was where the mound of dirt was, this jagged, unnatural hill that looked like it didn't belong. The older kids claimed it used to be a burial ground for horses. Why horses, I never knew. I never asked. But I never really believed it either. I mean, why horses? It made no sense. But what scared me, what really stuck with me, was the story about the black horse. They said it was evil, that it came at night, trampling anyone who dared to disturb the mound. They swore you could hear its hooves pounding the dirt if you sat under the trees and closed your eyes. I always laughed it off, stupid stories to scare kids, but deep down, I was curious. I was 12 when I decided to test it. It was a Thursday afternoon in early autumn. The air was cold and the clouds hung heavy, making the day feel darker than it should have. I stayed behind after school to finish a project with my friend Jamie, but Jamie bailed early, leaving me to pack up the art supplies on my own. By the time I stepped outside, the field was deserted. I don't know what possessed me to do it that day. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the trees swayed in the wind, whispering secrets to each other. Or maybe I was just stupid. I walked to the back of the field, my shoes crunching on the dry grass. The trees loomed over me like giants, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And there it was, the mound of dirt. It was bigger than I remembered, almost as if it had grown since the last time I'd seen it. I stood there for a while, just staring. I wasn't scared, not yet. Then I sat down under the biggest tree. The wind was louder here, rattling the branches above me. The air smelled damp, earthy. I closed my eyes and listened. At first there was nothing, just the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. But then, I heard it. Hooves. Faint at first, like distant thunder. I thought I was imagining it, but they grew louder, closer. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, just slightly, as if something massive was running toward me. I snapped my eyes open and looked around. Nothing. The field was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. But the sound didn't stop. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. No answer. Just the steady, relentless pounding of hooves. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe I was frozen. Maybe I didn't believe what I was hearing. But then I saw it. At first it was just a shadow, flickering between the trees. But as it moved closer, it took shape. A horse. A massive black horse. Its coat gleaming like oil in the dim light. Its eyes, God, its eyes were pure white, glowing like twin moons. It stood at the edge of the trees, staring at me. I couldn't move. Then it took a step forward. Its hooves hit the ground with a deafening crack, and I swear the earth shook beneath my feet. The air around it seemed to ripple, like heat waves on a summer road. "Stay back," I whispered, though my voice barely came out. The horse didn't listen. It lowered its head, baring sharp, yellowed teeth that no horse should have. Its breath came out in ragged, steaming huffs, even though the air wasn't cold enough for that. And then it charged. I don't remember deciding to run. My legs just moved on their own. I sprinted across the field, my backpack slamming against my back with every step. The sound of hooves was deafening now, each beat like a drum in my skull. I didn't dare look back. I reached the school building and slammed the door behind me, locking it without thinking. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. And then, silence. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Nothing. Maybe I imagined it, I thought. Maybe the stories got to me, and my mind played tricks on me. But when I looked down, I saw the mud on my shoes. And then I saw the hoof prints. They were everywhere. Massive, deep impressions in the dirt, circling the tree where I had been sitting, and leading away from the mound, toward the school. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the hooves in my head, over and over again. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. Who would? The next day at school, I avoided the field, but when I passed by the back windows, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The mound was gone. All that was left was flat, barren earth, and in the center of it, a single black feather. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know if the stories were true, or if I stumbled into something I shouldn't have, but I never went near those trees again. Story 3. I grew up in a small town in Romania, a place steeped in shadowy whispers and unsettling tales. My childhood was marked by the kind of fear only legends can instill, the kind that grows with every hushed conversation between adults, or every warning whispered at bedtime. But none of them terrified me as much as the one my mother repeated like a prayer. Stay away from the streets after dark. If the black ambulance sees you, it's over. The black ambulance wasn't just a story, it was a presence, a shadow cast over our town. Parents told their kids about it like a dark sermon. It would drive through neighborhoods, silent and predatory, snatching children in the blink of an eye. The victims were never the same. Days later, their bodies would be found abandoned in fields, hollowed out, missing pieces. And there was always money left near them, money no one ever dared to touch. For years, I believed it was just a story, a warning to keep us from wandering too far. That is, until the night it became real. It was winter, cold enough that you could see your breath in thick clouds, and the sun had long since set. I was 13, stubborn, and too old for ghost stories, or so I thought. My friend Andre dared me to sneak out to meet him. We were supposed to explore the abandoned textile factory at the edge of town. I hesitated. The thought of the black ambulance loomed, but Andre laughed it off. "Come on, it's just a stupid story. Don't tell me you're scared," he teased over the crackling phone line. I wasn't scared, not of stories anyway, but something about that night felt off, like the air was heavier, pressing down on me as I crept out of the house. I made it to the rendezvous point, a street corner lit by a single flickering lamp. Andre was waiting, grinning, his breath visible in the pale light. "See? Nothing to worry about," he said. We walked down the deserted streets, our footsteps muffled by the thin layer of snow on the ground. The town was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that prickles your skin. As we approached the factory, Andre stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened, straining against the quiet. At first there was nothing, but then a faint hum. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was growing louder. A chill ran down my spine. "Is that an engine?" Andre frowned, his bravado faltering. "Probably just a car. Let's keep going." But the hum became a growl, low and menacing, cutting through the stillness. We froze, our breath catching in our throats. From around the corner, headlights pierced the darkness, and then we saw it. A black van, sleek and gleaming, moving slowly down the street. The black ambulance. It wasn't just a story. It was real. Andre grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "Run!" he hissed. We bolted, our feet pounding against the pavement, slipping on the icy ground. The van's engine roared behind us, gaining speed. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it closing in, the headlights casting long, distorted shadows, that reached for us like claws. "Here!" Andre yanked me into an alleyway, and we pressed ourselves against the cold, damp wall. The van slowed, its engine purring like a predator sniffing out its prey. We held our breath, too terrified to move. It stopped. I heard the creak of a door opening, followed by heavy footsteps crunching on the snow. My heart was hammering so loudly I thought it would give us away. "Stay still," Andre mouthed, his eyes wide with terror. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate and unhurried, as if the driver knew we were there. A flashlight beam swept through the alley, illuminating the brick walls and the dumpsters. But somehow it missed us. My legs were trembling, and I felt like I was going to collapse. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the van's door slammed shut and the engine growled to life. It drove off. We waited for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into our bones. When we finally emerged, the street was empty. "I told you," Andre said, his voice shaking. "It's not real." But we both knew he was lying. I should have gone home. I should have left Andre there and run straight back to my mother's arms. But something pulled me back toward the factory. A morbid curiosity, or maybe just sheer stupidity. Andre didn't want to go, but I convinced him. "We'll just take a quick look," I said. "If it's gone, we'll leave." The factory loomed before us, its broken windows like jagged teeth. We slipped through a gap in the fence and entered the building. The air inside was thick with dust and decay. Our footsteps echoed in the vast empty space, and then we saw it. The van was parked in the center of the factory floor, its black paint gleaming even in the dim light. The back doors were open, revealing a sterile white interior. There were tools, scalpels, forceps, things I couldn't even name, laid out on a metal tray. Andre grabbed my arm. "We need to leave, now." But before we could move, we heard it, a soft, wet sound, like something being dragged. We turned him, and there it was, a figure in a long coat, its face obscured by a surgical mask, dragging a limp body across the floor. The body was small, child-sized, its skin pale and waxy. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Andre let out a strangled cry, and the figure's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto us. "Run!" I whispered, but Andre was frozen. The figure dropped the body and started toward us, its movements quick and deliberate. I grabbed Andre's hand and pulled him, screaming at him to move. We ran blindly, crashing into walls and stumbling over debris. Behind us, the figure's footsteps were relentless, echoing like a heartbeat. Somehow, we made it out. We didn't stop running until we reached my house. Andre didn't say a word. He just turned and walked away, his face pale and haunted. The next morning, the police were at the factory. Someone had found a body, a child, hollowed out and lifeless. There was money left beside it, just like the story said. I never saw Andre again after that night. His family moved away, and no one spoke of him. Story 4. Joey the Clown. I grew up in a sleepy corner of the city, the kind of place where kids spent their summers roaming around, making their own fun, and trying to stay out of trouble, or, in our case, finding just the right amount of it. Our patch of excitement was the old Victorian railway, long abandoned and transformed into a walking and cycling path. For the most part, it was harmless. Stretches of cracked tarmac lined with overgrown hedgerows, with sunlight cutting through the gaps like blades. But then there were the tunnels, two yawning, cavernous black holes that sliced through the hills like dark veins. When we were kids, those tunnels were our playgrounds. Before they were properly renovated, they were just mud and loose gravel, the air inside damp and cold no matter the season. They were pitch black, so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face without a torch. My friends and I dared each other to walk through them, just to see who had the guts to go in alone, and who would chicken out first. And then there was Joey. The legend of Joey the Clown was practically gospel among the kids in our neighborhood. According to the story, he'd been a circus performer, a lunatic who'd snapped one day and kidnapped a baby during a show. They said he strung the baby up by its feet from a pipe inside one of the tunnels, right in the path of an oncoming train. And when the train came barreling through, he threw himself in front of it, laughing like a maniac. Even as a kid, I didn't really believe it. It was just a story, a way to keep us from getting into too much trouble. Or so I thought. But I'd be lying if I said the idea of Joey didn't scare me, especially after dark. The older kids said you could still hear him in the tunnels at night. His laugh, the baby crying, and the rumble of a ghostly locomotive that hadn't run on those tracks in decades. My mom used the story to keep us in line too. She said Joey liked to prey on kids who wore mismatched socks or didn't have clean underwear. It was ridiculous, but we believed her just enough to double-check before we went exploring. One summer evening when I was about 14, my friends and I decided to go into the longer of the two tunnels, the one everyone said was Joey's haunt. It was dusk, and the fading light made the entrance look like a gaping mouth. I don't know what possessed us to do it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe we wanted to prove we weren't scared. Either way, we were armed with flashlights, a pocket full of nerves, and enough bravado to mask our fear. "All right," Mark said, his voice bouncing off the damp walls as we stood at the entrance. "First one to hear Joey has to buy the chips tomorrow." "Deal," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We ventured in, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the dark like thin swords. The tunnel swallowed sound, muffling the scrape of our footsteps and the nervous chatter between us. The air grew colder as we moved deeper, the smell of mildew and damp earth pressing against us like a living thing. Halfway in, Mark's flashlight flickered. "Cheap batteries," he muttered, smacking it against his palm. "Don't waste the light," I warned. "We've got a ways to go." We kept walking, the tunnel stretching endlessly ahead of us. The darkness felt thicker now, almost tangible, like it was pressing down on our shoulders. And then we heard it, a soft, distant laugh. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. "Shut up," Mark hissed, his own bravado cracking. "It's just the wind." It wasn't the wind. The laugh came again, closer this time, a raspy chuckle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I swung my flashlight around, the beam bouncing off the damp walls and the dripping ceiling. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't think—" Before I could finish, there was a sharp, high-pitched wail, a baby's cry. It echoed off the walls surrounding us, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Jesus Christ," Mark said, his voice shaking now. "That's not funny." "I'm not doing anything," I shot back. We stood frozen, the sound of the crying rising and falling like a siren. And then, faint at first, I heard it, the low, steady rumble of a train. "No way," Mark whispered. "The tracks are gone. There's no train." But the sound grew louder, the ground beneath our feet beginning to tremble. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure hanging from one of the pipes above us, swinging slightly. It was gone before I could focus, but the image was burned into my mind. "Run!" I said, grabbing Mark's arm. "Run!" We bolted, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the tunnel stretching on endlessly in front of us. The rumble grew louder, deafening now, and I swore I could hear the screech of metal on metal, the sound of an engine roaring toward us. Just as we reached the end of the tunnel, I risked one last glance over my shoulder. In the flickering beam of my flashlight, I saw him, a man in a tattered clown suit, his face pale and twisted into a grin. He stood in the center of the tunnel, watching us, and just as we burst into the open air, I heard it, a laugh, sharp and clear, echoing behind us. We didn't stop running until we were halfway home, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Neither of us said a word about what we'd seen or heard, but we both knew. Joey was real, or something was. I've never gone back to that tunnel, not even in daylight. I don't tell this story often, but when I do, people always ask the same question. Do you really think it was him? I don't know. I don't want to know. Story 5. My name is Dave Larson, and I've lived in the small town of Choteau, Montana, my whole life. It's quiet here, peaceful for the most part, nestled right against the eastern edge of the Rockies. I've always loved driving the back roads at night, and especially Highway 464, also known as Duck Lake Road. Something about the vast emptiness and the moon casting its cold light on the plains. It makes you feel alive, you know? At least it used to. This happened about 6 years ago, but I swear to God, it's as clear in my head as if it happened last night. I was coming back late from Cut Bank after helping a buddy move some heavy equipment. It was about 11:30 p.m. the kind of cold that bites through your jacket and settles in your bones. The highway was dead quiet. Not a single car in sight for miles, just me, the distant sound of the wind, and the rhythmic hum of my truck's engine. I was maybe 20 miles from home when my truck started acting up. At first it was just a flicker in the headlights, then the dashboard lights dimmed. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then nothing. Dead. The whole thing just died, leaving me in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of nothing but darkness and open plains. I didn't panic, not at first. I've been around cars my whole life, so I grabbed my flashlight, popped the hood, and started poking around. But here's the thing. It all looked fine. No loose wires, no leaks, nothing burned out. I couldn't make sense of it. That's when I started to feel it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned off my flashlight and looked around. The highway stretched out behind me and ahead of me, just a long black ribbon under the stars. I didn't see anything, but that feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to being alone in the middle of the night. I was about to head back into the truck to call for help when I saw the headlights. They appeared out of nowhere, way down the highway behind me. Just a single pair of headlights, bright and steady, heading my way. Relief flooded through me. Someone to help, finally. I grabbed my flashlight and stood by the side of the road, waving it to get their attention. The car slowed as it approached, and I could make out its shape. A black sedan, older model, maybe a 70s make. The kind of car that seemed out of place in these parts. It stopped a few feet ahead of my truck, and I remember thinking how quiet it was. No engine noise, no crunch of gravel, nothing. The doors opened, and 3 men stepped out. They were all dressed in black suits, the kind you'd wear to a funeral, with crisp white shirts underneath. No ties, though. That struck me as odd. They were tall, all 3 of them, with faces that were wrong. Not deformed or anything, just too pale, too smooth, like mannequins brought to life. And their eyes, God, I'll never forget their eyes. Dark, empty, like the night itself. "Need some help?" one of them asked. His voice was flat, emotionless, but polite. Too polite. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah, my truck just died. No idea what's wrong." The 3 of them exchanged a look, not saying a word, then moved toward my truck. They didn't need flashlights. They just moved like they already knew exactly where everything was. I stood back watching them work, but something about the way they moved made my stomach churn. Too fluid, too synchronized, like they weren't really human. One of them straightened up and looked at me. "Try it now," he said. I climbed into the cab, turned the key, and just like that, the engine roared to life. Relief and confusion hit me all at once. I got out to thank them, but before I could get a word out, I noticed something. Their car. Where the hell was it? It was gone. I mean, completely gone, as if it had never been there. I turned back to the men, my heart pounding in my chest. "Where's your car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They didn't answer. Instead, they just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Then, without a word, they turned and started walking down the highway, away from me, into the darkness. I stood there frozen, watching them until they disappeared completely, swallowed by the night. I didn't stick around after that. I jumped back in my truck and drove like hell, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. By the time I got home, my body was trembling and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Who would believe me? But over time, I started hearing stories from other locals. People talked about strange headlights on Highway 464 that would vanish into thin air. Others mentioned a trio of men who seemed to appear out of nowhere to help stranded drivers, only to vanish just as quickly. And then there's the story of the Native American man. People say he appears out of nowhere, right in the middle of the road, wearing a denim jacket and jeans. Drivers swear they've hit him, but when they stop to check, there's no one there. I don't know if the 2 stories are connected, and honestly, I don't care to find out. I haven't driven that highway at night since. Some things I think are better left unexplained. So if you ever find yourself on Highway 464 late at night and you see a pair of headlights coming up behind you, do yourself a favor. Don't stop. And if you do, pray it's just car trouble. Story 6. I live alone in a small cabin nestled deep within the Appalachian forests. It's the kind of solitude I've always craved. Out here, the silence is thick, broken only by the occasional howl of a distant coyote or the rustling of wind through the trees. My nearest neighbor is a 30-minute drive away, and I like it that way. But there's something else about these woods, something I didn't understand until one particular night. It started like any other. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the trees. The forest always feels different at night, heavier, almost alive. I was sitting in my living room with the windows open, enjoying the cool breeze when I heard it. A faint tap, tap, tap. I froze, straining to listen. It was subtle, almost rhythmic, like fingers drumming on wood. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin. Normally, I'd brush off a sound like that. It could have been a branch or some animal. But this time, it didn't feel right. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was colder than it should have been for that time of year, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shone the light around, sweeping it across the trees, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the endless stretch of woods. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Only now it was closer. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. No response, just the sound of leaves rustling. I took a few cautious steps toward the noise, keeping the flashlight steady. The beam landed on the side of the cabin, where a small pile of firewood was stacked. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a flash of something darting behind the woodpile. "Hey!" I shouted, taking a few quick steps forward. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it at the woodpile. Nothing moved. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, half expecting some raccoon or squirrel to scurry out. But then I saw it, a small, pale hand gripping the edge of a log. It wasn't a child's hand. It was too thin, the fingers too long, the skin almost translucent under the beam of my flashlight. I took a step back, bile rising in my throat. "What the hell?" Before I could finish, the hand disappeared, and a low, chittering sound filled the air. It wasn't quite a laugh, but close enough to send a shiver down my spine. I backed away toward the cabin, not daring to turn my back on the woodpile. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground. And then I saw them. They stepped out from behind the woodpile, 3 of them. They were no more than 6 inches tall, their bodies unnaturally thin and twisted. Their faces were blank, featureless, except for deep-set, glinting eyes that reflected the light like a predator's. They didn't speak. They just stood there, staring at me with those black, soulless eyes. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. One of them tilted its head, almost curiously, before taking a step toward me. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The other 2 followed, their tiny feet making no sound against the ground. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight in my panic. The beam swung wildly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around the tiny figures. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. They didn't stop. In my terror, I scrambled to pick up the flashlight, but my hands were shaking too much. By the time I got it, they were gone. The woodpile was empty. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the isolation was finally getting to me. But then I heard it, tap, tap, tap. This time it was coming from above. I looked up slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The flashlight beam caught movement on the roof, shadows darting back and forth, too quick to follow. I bolted for the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, faster, circling the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. It was on the walls now. The windows, the ceiling. They were everywhere. I grabbed the rifle I kept by the door, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something so small. The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the cabin into an eerie silence. I stood there, rifle in hand, every muscle in my body tense. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, but nothing else. Then the whispering started. It came from all around me, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, if they were saying anything at all, but it was enough to drive me to the brink of panic. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, aiming the rifle at the nearest window. The whispering stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. No tapping, no movement, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. And then, I saw it. One of them was standing on the windowsill, staring at me through the glass. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its mouth was stretched into a grin that was too wide, too human. I didn't think. I raised the rifle and fired. The sound was deafening in the small cabin, but when I looked back, the window was empty. I don't know how long I stayed like that, clutching the rifle and staring at the shattered glass. Eventually, the first light of dawn broke through the trees, and the oppressive weight that had filled the cabin lifted. When I finally stepped outside, there was no sign of them. No footprints, no damage. Nothing to suggest they'd ever been there. But I know what I saw. I haven't spent a night in that cabin since. Story 7. My name is James Carter, and I grew up in Polson, Montana, right at the southern edge of Flathead Lake. Life here is quiet, simple, and mostly uneventful. But there's something about the lake, something that gnaws at the back of your mind if you let it. People talk about it sometimes in hushed tones, especially the old-timers. They call it the Flathead Lake Monster. I always brushed it off as local lore, a fun little campfire tale. But last summer, my perspective changed, and I don't think I'll ever see the world the same way again. It was a muggy August evening when it happened. I'd been out fishing with my buddy Eric. He had a little motorboat, nothing fancy, but it got us out past the usual spots where people swarm during the day. We'd stayed later than planned because the fish weren't biting, and we weren't ready to call it quits. The sun had dipped below the Mission Mountains, leaving the sky streaked with deep oranges and purples, and the water was dead calm, flat as a sheet of glass. The air smelled faintly of pine and algae, and there wasn't a single sound except the occasional lap of water against the hull. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. We were anchored near the middle of the lake, where it's the deepest, over 400 feet. I remember Eric fiddling with the tackle box, muttering about how, "This spot's got to pay off sooner or later." I just leaned back and stared at the horizon, letting the stillness settle over me. Then out of nowhere, the boat rocked. It wasn't a gentle nudge either. It was sharp, deliberate, like something had bumped us hard from underneath. "What the hell was that?" Eric snapped, his voice tight. "Probably just a log," I said, though my pulse had quickened. Flathead's known for its driftwood after all, but deep down I knew it wasn't a log. The hit had come from below, straight up, not from the side. Eric grabbed a flashlight and shone it over the edge, the beam cutting into the inky black water. "Do you see anything?" he asked. I shook my head. The water was too dark, too opaque. Another jolt. This one was harder, enough to make us both stagger. The boat tilted slightly, and for a terrifying second, I thought we might capsize. Eric cursed loudly, dropping the flashlight, and it rolled across the deck. "Maybe it's a sturgeon," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A sturgeon big enough to do that?" I shot back. We both went quiet, straining to listen for something, anything. And that's when I heard it, a low guttural sound, like a deep rumble, coming from beneath us. It wasn't the kind of noise you hear from a fish or a boat engine. It was organic, alive. I could feel it too, vibrations reverberating through the hull of the boat, making my teeth chatter. "Get us out of here," I whispered, my throat dry. Eric didn't argue. He scrambled to the controls and fired up the engine. The roar shattered the stillness, and we started moving, but we didn't get far. Something caught the propeller. The boat lurched violently, the engine screaming as it strained against whatever had snagged it. Eric killed the motor, cursing under his breath, and we drifted to a stop. "Cut the line," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not the damn line," he shot back, grabbing a pole with a hook on the end to try and dislodge whatever was down there. He leaned over the side, plunging the hook into the water, but froze mid-motion. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What?" "Something's moving." I leaned over. my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. At first, I didn't see anything, just the faint reflection of the moon on the rippling surface. But then I noticed it, a shadow, massive and slow, gliding just beneath the water. It was long, impossibly long, with a shape that defied logic. It looked serpentine, but there were ridges along its back, like the plates of an alligator, only much larger. The head, I can't even describe it. I only caught a glimpse, but it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It moved with purpose, circling the boat like a predator, sizing up its prey. Eric dropped the pole with a clatter and stumbled back, his face pale as a ghost. "We need to move. Now," he stammered. "How?" I snapped. The engine was useless and the oars wouldn't get us out of there fast enough. The shadow passed underneath us again, closer this time, and the boat swayed violently. The rumbling sound returned, louder now, almost deafening. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the water, hoping to blind whatever was down there. For a split second, the beam caught something, a glossy, dark eye the size of a dinner plate staring back at me. It blinked. I screamed, dropping the flashlight, and the boat pitched hard to the side. Eric lost his footing and slid across the deck, nearly going overboard. I grabbed his arm just in time, hauling him back as he scrambled for grip. "We're gonna die out here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, we're not," I said, though I didn't believe it. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The water went still, the vibrations ceased, and the shadow vanished. We sat there paralyzed, waiting for the next hit, the next sign that it was still there. But nothing came. After what felt like an eternity, Eric managed to get the engine running again. We didn't talk, didn't even look at each other as we sped back to the dock. When we finally reached shore, we jumped out of the boat and collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air. Eric was the first to break the silence. "We don't tell anyone about this," he said firmly. "Who'd believe us?" I muttered, staring out at the lake. "To this day, I don't know what we saw out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been back on the water since, and Eric sold his boat a week later. Flathead Lake looks beautiful, serene, like a postcard come to life. But there's something in those depths, something ancient and hungry, and I'll never forget the way it blinked at me." Story 8. I don't talk about what happened very often. I'm not sure why I agreed to this. Maybe I'm tired of keeping it in. Maybe I think telling it will make someone else understand why I don't sleep so well anymore. But here it is, for whatever it's worth. It was the winter of 1974. I was 23, just a dumb kid from Boise who thought he could make a name for himself by running a search and rescue team. I wasn't doing it for the right reasons, I'll admit that. The thrill of the hunt, the adrenaline of a crisis, the glory of being a hero, that's what I wanted. And that's what I thought I was going to get when the sheriff's office called me about those hunters up in the Oahees. It was a group of 4 men, all experienced outdoorsmen, gone missing for 2 weeks. Their families said they'd gone up to hunt elk and never came back. A snowstorm had hit hard just days after they left, and no one had heard a word since. People figured they were holed up somewhere, maybe injured, maybe dead. My team and I were supposed to find out. We set out at dawn, a convoy of 4 snowmobiles and 6 men, all loaded with supplies. The trail wasn't easy to follow. The snow had buried everything. But we knew roughly where their cabin was supposed to be. By midday, the wind had picked up, and the trees around us started to feel like walls. I remember thinking it was unnaturally quiet, like even the birds knew better than to stick around. We found the cabin just before sundown. It was small, one of those old trapper shacks left over from the 1800s, sitting crooked at the edge of a frozen clearing. I didn't like it. Something about it felt wrong, like it shouldn't have still been standing. But there it was, and we had a job to do. The door was locked from the inside. That was the first thing. No tracks in the snow, no signs of anyone coming or going. Just this battered old door, bolted shut. We called out, but no one answered. One of my guys, Jerry, had to kick it in. The smell hit us first. Blood and rot, heavy enough to make your stomach churn. I wish I could forget that smell. Inside it was dark. Too dark, considering there was still light outside. The windows were shut tight and locked. their glass smeared with something I didn't want to identify. We found them in the main room, the hunters, 4 men seated around a small wooden table like they'd been playing cards. Only they weren't playing anymore. Their heads, God, their heads. They were crushed, every single one of them, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to their skulls. Blood had pooled beneath them, thick and dark, staining the floorboards. But there was no weapon, no footprints, no sign of a struggle, nothing. Jesus Christ, Jerry whispered, crossing himself. None of us spoke for a while after that. The cabin felt wrong, too cold, too still, like the air itself was pressing down on us. One of the guys, Tim, said he thought he heard something upstairs, like footsteps. We all froze. "Someone's still here," he said, his voice shaking. We didn't want to go up there, but we couldn't leave without checking. Jerry and I took the lead, our flashlights cutting through the dark as we climbed the narrow staircase. The steps creaked under our boots, every sound echoing too loud in the silence. The upstairs was empty, just an old bed frame and a window, locked tight from the inside like the rest of the cabin. But I swear to God, I felt like something was watching us, not from the room, but from somewhere else, somewhere close. We went back downstairs trying to figure out what to do. Tim wanted to leave, to get the hell out of there and let the sheriff handle it. But we couldn't just abandon the bodies. We decided to mark the location and head back to town for help. That's when the door slammed shut. It happened so fast I almost didn't believe it. 1 second it was open, swinging on its broken hinges. The next it was shut tight, the bolt sliding into place on its own. "Who's there?" Jerry shouted, spinning around with his flashlight. No answer. Just that awful silence, heavier than ever. Tim tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, not even an inch. "We need to go," he said, his voice cracking. "We need to go now." The windows wouldn't open either. We were trapped, stuck in that cursed place with the dead men and the thing that had killed them, whatever it was. Then we heard it, a sound I'll never forget. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it was coming from inside the cabin. It grew louder, deeper, until it felt like the walls were vibrating. And then it stopped, replaced by something worse. Breathing, slow, heavy, wet breathing, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Tim lost it. He started screaming, banging on the door, trying to kick it down. The rest of us just stood there, frozen, our flashlights darting around the room, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. And then the lights went out. I don't know how long we were in the dark. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like forever. I remember the sound of someone running, a crash, a scream. I remember cold hands brushing against me, the smell of blood, the weight of the air pressing against my chest. When the lights came back on, Tim was gone. The door was open, swinging lazily on its hinges. We didn't question it. We just ran, leaving everything behind. I don't even remember how we made it back to town, but we did. They sent another team up the next day. They didn't find anything. No bodies, no blood, not even the cabin. I never went back to the Oahees after that. I can't even look at a picture of those mountains without feeling sick. People say I made it up, that it was the cold or the altitude or my imagination. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things are just meant to be left alone. Story 9. I've lived in San Antonio my whole life, in a quiet neighborhood not too far from the old train tracks everyone whispers about. Growing up, I'd heard the stories, the ghost kids, the handprints, the tragic accident, but I never gave them much thought. Urban legends are part of life here, like the Alamo or the Riverwalk. People talk, they embellish, and life goes on. That's what I always thought anyway, until one night when I found myself face to face with something I can't explain. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween. My cousin Jason was visiting from Austin, and we'd been sitting around my backyard, swapping ghost stories over a couple of beers. At some point, Jason brought up the tracks. "Dude, you ever done the powder thing?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. I shook my head, laughing. "You mean the handprints? Come on, that's just a bunch of crap. People see what they want to see." Jason grinned. "So you've never tried it?" "Nope, never saw the point." Let's do it, he said, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. What's the worst that could happen? You prove me wrong, and I buy the next round tomorrow. I hesitated. It was a stupid idea, but something about the challenge made me want to go through with it. Fine, I said, standing up. But when nothing happens, you're cleaning my car. We grabbed a bag of flour from the kitchen and piled into my old Honda Civic. The drive to the tracks took about 15 minutes. The streets eerily empty that late at night. The closer we got, the quieter Jason became. When we finally pulled up to the crossing, my stomach tightened. The place was darker than I'd expected. The streetlights dim and far apart. The tracks cut through the road like a scar, stretching endlessly in both directions. I parked a few feet away and turned off the engine. Jason handed me the flour. All right, let's see what these ghost kids are made of. I popped the trunk and dusted the rear bumper with a thick layer of flour, making sure to cover every inch. The night air was chilly, and the silence pressed in around us like a weight. You ready? Jason asked as I climbed back into the driver's seat. Ready as I'll ever be, I muttered, putting the car in neutral. We rolled slowly toward the tracks, the incline slight but noticeable. I kept my foot off the brake, letting gravity do the work. As the front tires crossed the rails, I felt a strange, subtle resistance, like something was pushing back against the car. Do you feel that? I asked, glancing at Jason. Feel what? Never mind. The car came to a stop just past the tracks, and for a moment, nothing happened. I exhaled, half relieved, half annoyed. See? Told you it's a... Then the car moved. It wasn't much, just a slight lurch, like someone had given it a gentle shove. But it was enough to shut me up. I stared at Jason, his face pale in the glow of the dashboard. Dude, he whispered, did you do that? No, I said, my voice shaking. No, I didn't. Before either of us could say another word, the car began to roll. It wasn't fast, but it was steady, as if invisible hands were guiding it forward. My heart pounded in my chest and every instinct screamed at me to hit the brake, but I couldn't move. Jason, I croaked, what the hell is happening? He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something behind us, his expression frozen in terror. Jason, I said again, louder this time. What do you see? His hand shot out, gripping my arm with bone-crushing force. Don't look, he hissed. Just drive. Get us out of here. Panic took over, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires squealed as we sped down the road, the tracks disappearing in the rearview mirror. Jason didn't let go of my arm until we were a good mile away, his breathing ragged and uneven. Okay, I said, pulling over to the side of the road. What the hell just happened back there? Jason didn't answer. He just pointed at the rearview mirror. I turned around slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The flour on the bumper was covered in handprints, small, child-sized handprints, dozens of them, overlapping like a chaotic puzzle. My blood ran cold. This has to be a joke, I said, my voice trembling. You did this when I wasn't looking, right? Right? Jason shook his head, his face ashen. I didn't touch it, man. I swear I wanted to believe him, but the look in his eyes told me he was as scared as I was. And then I remembered something else, the resistance I'd felt when the car crossed the tracks. Jason, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What did you see back there? He hesitated, his hands shaking. There was someone behind the car. Kids, a whole group of them. They were pushing us. I stared at him, my mind racing. That's not funny. I'm not joking, he said, his voice breaking. They were there, man. I saw them. They looked wrong, pale, hollow, like they didn't belong. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. We're going home, I said, starting the engine. Now. We drove in silence, neither of us daring to look back. That night I barely slept, haunted by the memory of those handprints in Jason's terrified face. The next morning I went out to check the car in the daylight, hoping to find some rational explanation. But the handprints were gone, as if they'd never been there. I haven't been back to the track since. Story 10. I grew up in a small, forgettable town in New Jersey, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were only whispered about in the shadows. I was 17 when I first heard about the Devil's Tree. It was a story parents told to scare their kids and a dare teenagers threw around on restless Friday nights. Most of us didn't believe a word of it, at least not entirely. The tree stood in the middle of an empty field on the outskirts of a neighboring town, about a 20-minute drive from where I lived. People said it was cursed, dead as stone, its gnarled branches clawed at the sky, refusing to fall even as decades of storms tried to bring it down. Snow wouldn't stick to the ground around it, and no animal would go near it. But the stories that really stuck with me, the ones that sent a shiver down my spine, were about what happened to people who disrespected it. There were too many tales to ignore. Cars breaking down, freak accidents, and even deaths. Every one of them tied back to that damn tree. Still, I figured they were just exaggerated small-town gossip, until the night I saw it for myself. It was late December, a week before Christmas, when my best friend Danny suggested we go see the Devil's Tree. Danny was always the type to chase a thrill, and he had a way of talking you into things you knew were a bad idea. "Come on, man," he'd said, grinning like the devil himself. "What's the worst that could happen?" That night, it was just me, Danny, and a girl from school named Tessa. She wasn't exactly a friend, but she had a car and didn't scare easy, which made her the perfect addition to our little adventure. The three of us piled into her old Toyota and headed out to the field, the cold biting through our jackets as we drove in silence. When we pulled up to the edge of the field, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The tree stood in the distance, silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. It looked wrong, like it didn't belong there, its blackened limbs twisting unnaturally against the night sky. "I thought it'd be bigger," Danny said, breaking the silence. He sounded disappointed. Tessa cut the engine and turned to us. "Well, there it is. Let's go see if it's as creepy as everyone says." I didn't want to get out of the car. Something about that tree made my skin crawl, but I couldn't let Danny or Tessa see I was scared. So I followed them into the field, the snow crunching under our boots. As we got closer, the temperature seemed to drop, and my breath came out in thick white clouds. But around the tree there was no snow, just a ring of blackened dirt that looked like it had been scorched. "See? Nothing but an old, dead tree," Danny said, reaching out to touch the trunk. "I don't get what everyone's so worked up about." "Don't touch it," Tessa snapped, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. She looked scared, and that scared me more than anything. Danny smirked. "What's the big deal? It's just a tree." But then he did something I'll never forget. He unzipped his pants and started pissing on the tree, laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. "Take that, devil's tree," he shouted, his voice echoing across the empty field. "Danny, stop!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "What the hell are you doing?" But it was too late. As soon as he finished, the wind picked up out of nowhere, howling through the field like a scream. The tree's branches shook violently, even though the air had been completely still a moment before. Tessa grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling. Danny, still laughing, zipped up his pants and started walking back toward the car. "You guys are such wimps," he said over his shoulder. "It's just a stupid—" He didn't finish his sentence. The headlights of Tessa's car flickered to life, casting a harsh glow across the field. For a split second, I thought I saw something move near the base of the tree, something black and shapeless, shifting in the shadows. But then the lights went out again, plunging us into darkness. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. "See what?" Tessa asked, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the car's engine roared to life on its own. The headlights blazed, but this time they weren't pointing at us. They were aimed directly at Danny. He froze, staring into the blinding light like a deer caught in the road. "Danny, get out of the way!" I shouted, but he didn't move. The car's horn blared, long and deafening, and then the engine revved. Tessa screamed as the car lurched forward, its tires kicking up dirt and snow. It barreled straight toward Danny, who finally snapped out of his trance and tried to run. But the car was faster. It hit him head-on, sending his body flying through the air before slamming into the tree with a sickening crunch. Everything went quiet again. The car sat motionless, its engine dead, steam rising from the crumpled hood. Danny lay on the ground in a twisted heap, his eyes wide open but unseeing. Tessa dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, while I stood there, frozen in shock. "We have to call someone," I said, my voice shaking. But when I reached for my phone, the screen was black. No signal. Tessa's phone was dead too. The only sound was the faint creaking of the tree, its branches swaying in the windless night. We didn't stay long after that. Somehow we managed to drag Tessa's car out of the field and back onto the road, leaving Danny's body behind. None of us spoke on the drive home. When we finally got back to town, Tessa dropped me off without a word. The next morning I heard the news. Danny had been found dead near the Devil's Tree. They said it was a hit and run, but no one could explain how the car had crashed into the tree and then disappeared without a trace. I've never gone back to that field and I don't plan to. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.